All right, so let's create our first context. Start by creating a new directory called contexts. So we'll say mkdir source contexts, just like that. And when we do that, it should be right there. Cool, great, we see that, contexts, lovely. Then create a new file inside that contexts directory called auth, auth.js. So touch source contexts auth.js, just like that. And then open up that file and let's create a context. Now, context is created with the react.createContext method, so we're going to need to import it. Create context from React, just like that. And then create one here, const auth context equals create context. And if you weren't sure what I was saying, like context, because maybe I don't enunciate well enough, context with an X, context. And if you actually just like want to see the docs for it, the React docs here, context, you can see it right there. It's in part of the advanced guides. Now, another thing about context is, by the way, they use exactly what we're saying here. This is what I'm saying. Context provides a way to pass data through the component tree without having to pass props down manually at every level. But the actual examples they use here they use a lot of like the class syntax, which we have been avoiding in this series just because it's the old version of React that's actually not recommended by the React team. But they still, because React has used classes for so long before this, that it's seen throughout the docs. So that's actually something to be aware of. Though we almost entirely use functions and hooks, and we keep class and this.state and other stuff out of it. So just so you know, at least like when you look at these docs, it's important to at least be aware of that. But if you want to learn more, here's where it is. Go to Advanced Guides, Context. You can read up all about it. And again, I highly recommend just go through all of the docs for React. They're just as good as you can find. Cool. So we have created this new context object, and this context object here with the create context method provides two things, by the way. It provides an object. All it does is return an object with two components, or two properties, a provider and consumer component. We'll only really concern ourselves with the provider component, but just to at least know that it exists here. We could have totally done this, const consumer, or their components. So we'd say consumer provider equals create context null. And this null is just the default state for our context, which I almost always set to null. I never give it a default value of anything. That's just like by convention. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to give anything a default value for the most part. And so this auth context is going to have two properties on it, the consumer and the provider. But all we're going to deal with is the provider. So I kind of just get rid of the consumer and just say that. But we'll just keep it as auth context for now, just so that we're super clear about what we're making. Then we're going to create a auth context provider component that wraps the auth context. So export const auth context provider equals, and it's just a component that takes in some children. And let's actually grab some state also, use state from React. And we'll say const user set user equals use state. And it'll be an empty object, just like we did in our app. Then we will return an auth context.provider. And again, remember that this is just an object with a provider component attached to it. So then that component will render any children, and it should accept a single prop, which is the value prop. And that value prop is going to be anything we want to pass down. And so we're going to pass down here both of the state and the state handler, auth set user and user, and we're going to store it in an object called auth value and just pass that down right here, just like that. Cool. Now, there's a couple interesting things here, and I just like wrote a bunch of code and didn't explain any of it, so if you're mad at me, I'm sorry, but I want to get this in here so like we can chat about it for a second. Our component creates a simple user object in state like this, and then renders the auth context.provider that was returned by create context. Now, whenever we pass, or whatever we pass as data to the value prop of the auth context provider, what the provider does, what context does, is it makes sure that anything that's rendered inside of it, any children that are nested inside it, can subscribe to this data here and get access to that value. Then all this component does is simply renders its children. And by the way, if you're unfamiliar with what the children prop is in React, you can think of it like this. Like if you have a div and you put an h1 inside it like that, hey, that div right here, it's nesting this child component inside of it. Now in React, if you have a custom component, like our auth context provider here, if I do this instead, anything that's nested inside of my auth context provider gets passed as the children prop to the component. So now the children prop is equal to an h1 that says, hey. Just simple as that. That's all the children prop is saying. So what our component here does is it just accepts any children. So anything we put inside it like this, that it nests inside it, it takes it and it renders them inside the auth context.provider. This is just a neat way to wrap all of the context inside a provider so that anything in here, any component that's like deeply nested in here, maybe we have like another component that's a form, and then that form has like a bunch of other stuff in it. Any of the children of form even still have access to that value if they subscribe to it. Now the next question might be is like, how do they subscribe to it? Well, that's what we're going to do next. The other thing that React provides is this use context hook. And this use context hook accepts a context object, the value returned from react.createContext, and returns the current context value, which is just this right here, as given by the nearest context provider for the given context. Now that's using the word context like 6 times and it's kind of confusing. All you need to know is we create this hook here. We're going to export a const called use auth context, and it is going to be equal to a function that returns the use context hook that React provides us, and we give it a context object. Now the context object we give it is the one created by createContext, just like this. Ta-da! Now, okay, we've used the word context so many times that sometimes it's one of those things where it begins to lose meaning almost. Like, what exactly are you talking about here? Well, let me explain to you. And again, it's going to make so much more sense when you actually just see it in action, but I want to provide as much context as possible about what is happening here before we actually use it. Use context takes one argument, the context for which it should look up in the tree, and then returns a value it finds for that context. Now we're saying, hey, the only thing you should look for is the auth context here. And it exists inside our auth context provider. And so this hook is going to be used by any component that wants access to this value here. Okay, now I've explained as much of this as I possibly can without actually writing the code to use it. So now let's see it in action. First thing we need to do is we need to make sure that all of our routes in our application are children of the auth context provider component. So open the app component like this. Ta-da! And inside here, let's import the auth context provider and the use auth context hook that we just created. So we'll say import auth context provider and use auth context from hook or contexts auth, just like that. Then right here, we're going to create a new function, and we're no longer going to export default this function app. Instead, we're going to export default a function called app container. And this app container function is going to return the auth context provider, and nested inside it is the app itself. Now, why did we do that? Well, we did that so that everything that's inside app, which means the app component, and all of its children, anything inside here also, any of these routes, the nav bar, all this stuff, now are able to use that use auth context hook to subscribe to all of the data inside our auth context here. So anything that now uses the use context hook now has access to that value. By the way, if you don't do this, if you don't wrap the app, or at least whatever component is trying to use the context with the provider, it won't work. It won't find that provider and you won't be able to access that data. So just know that that's a thing. So now one way you can do it is like, hey, let's get rid of this thing here. We no longer need that. You're like, no, our user's gone. Well, it's easy. We can just come in here and say const user set user is equal to use auth context. And now nothing's really changed. Now, this isn't a great example since the app is like directly beneath the app container, so like it doesn't really need to do that. But now it's all centralized inside our auth context. So this app is able to use the use auth context hook and gain access to the user and the set user handler, along with any other component in our application. So let's save this. Let's make sure nothing broke. Maybe something broke. Okay, cool. Looks like it didn't. Okay, got you. Did I need to... Oh, I think I need to add it here. Cool, thanks. So we need to add the set user hook there. Cool, still seems to be working. Let's go back here and make sure things work as before. Let's say Kermit at thefrog.io, password. Okay, cool. So it seems like everything still works. We're still able to log in just like before. It looks like we still have access to our user here. Maybe I have some other stuff. Okay, cool. I guess I gotta fix that a little bit somewhere in here. Fine, totally understand. But regardless, this seems to be working. This is like, it's pretty cool. We're now now taking out or have some global state for our application and putting it all inside our auth context and making it available to everywhere else in our component. But we didn't create an auth context just to use it the same way we do with local state. Instead, let's do this. Let's go to a more deeply nested component like post.js and also make sure it works there. So in post.js, head in there and let's first, let's just say import stars from components. Let's change this import structure so it's nicer, just like that. And then let's also import that hook. Now remember that post is nested inside home, which is nested inside app, which is nested inside app container. But we can do this, import use auth context from contexts auth. And instead of having that user passed around to our component, we can just say const user equals use auth context, just like that. And when we save it, we can create, we should be able to refresh the app. It should still work fine. Cool. We should be able to create one here. Gotcha. Submit. Cool, that works. And it still recognizes that I am the owner right here. Const with user owns post. So it seems to be working perfectly. So it still knows that, hey, I'm the user. Hello. And we save it. And it works. And we're so excited. And it's magical. And everything is great. And I mean, that's exactly what we're hoping for, right? So with everything working the way we want it to at this point, I think it's now time to pause for a second and take a step back. It's a lot, and I know that. And so if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, that's totally fine. We've covered a ton of ground, but all that we've really done here is we've taken what originally used to exist in our app.js under the user use state section, and we've extracted that into what's known as a context. And again, a context is just a global state provider that we can use at any level of nesting throughout our application. And right now we're not even really using it that much, but all we've done here is we've removed the need to pass user around our application, though we haven't really done it with fidelity because we haven't used this actual used auth context hook everywhere. But that is the purpose, is that we now, instead of having to supply this user object in our top level app component and pass it everywhere, we can now just take it out of context, or take it from a context and pass it direct, or have it any component consume it by using this use auth context hook. So we're going to focus a little bit more about how to combine certain strategies that we've seen before to improve our architecture. But at this point, like, we've done enough work that we can just go ahead and save our work and call it a day. Git status, git add, git commit, added auth context to application. There we go.